Hey, everyone, and welcome back, with International Women's Day just behind us. I thought this would be a perfect time to really dig into some women's issues.
Yeah.
Specifically in Guyana.
Interesting.
We have a really fascinating source for this deep dive.
Okay.
It's actually a press conference by the Alliance for Change.
Okay.
Which is a Guyanese political party. And they held this just a few days ago on March 7th, 2025.
Wow, so really recent.
Yeah, super recent.
Very current.
Very up-to-the-minute perspective.
Yeah.
And what we're going to try to do today is really dissect how the AFC is approaching the biggest challenges that women in Guyana are facing, and even more importantly, what they're actually proposing to do about them.
Well, and what's so interesting about this press conference is that it really gives us a glimpse into a very specific political platform. Right. We're not dealing with broad statistics or academic research here.
Right.
This is a party that's, on the ground laying out their vision for how to tackle these really complex issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that really jumped out at me when I was looking at the source material is this whole idea of a women's bank that they're proposing.
Interesting.
They seem to think that this would be a total game changer in terms of economic empowerment for women in Guyana.
Right.
But to be honest, I'm kind of struggling to wrap my head around how this would actually work in practice.
Yeah, it is an intriguing idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
You see, access to finance is a huge problem for women globally.
Mm-hmm.
They often face way more difficulty getting loans, starting businesses, things like that.
Right.
So the AFC is thinking is that a dedicated bank, tailored specifically to women's needs, could actually offer products and services that address these very specific challenges.
So it's almost like they're saying, instead of just advocating for equal access to the existing, financial institutions.
Exactly.
Let's just create a whole new system.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty bold.
It is bold for sure.
But wouldn't that be incredibly complex and expensive to create and run a whole new bank?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
The AFC hasn't actually released a super detailed blueprint yet, so we don't know the specifics of how they envision this bank operating or, how they would overcome the logistical and financial hurdles that would inevitably come up.
Right, of course.
But the idea itself, I think, highlights a really crucial point.
What's that?
If existing systems aren't meeting the needs of women, maybe we need to think outside the box a little bit.
Yeah, I see your point. It's forcing us to confront those limitations.
Mm-hmm.
But even if this women's bank idea doesn't pan out, I do think at least it gets people talking about how we can better support women entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
And make sure that they have access to the capital that they need to succeed.
Couldn't agree more. And, while we're on the topic of economic empowerment, the AFC also brought up some concerns about a program that was actually supposed to help women access higher education.
Oh, yeah.
The Gold Scholarship.
Yeah, I saw that. And apparently some universities aren't even recognizing it.
Right. It seems like a logistical nightmare.
What's going on there?
Well, imagine investing all this time and energy, going after a degree, only to find out that your scholarship isn't accepted.
Right.
And they even shared a story of a woman who found herself in that exact situation.
Wow.
It's a huge setback, not just for the individuals who are affected,
of course,
but also for the whole idea of promoting education as a pathway to empowerment.
Yeah, it's so frustrating because it really highlights how even when programs are put in place with good intentions, there can be these unforeseen roadblocks that just totally undermine their effectiveness.
Absolutely.
What is the AFC suggesting that be done about this?
Well, they're really calling for greater transparency and accountability from the scholarship program itself.
Mm-hmm.
They want to know which universities aren't recognizing it and why. And they're also demanding a clear plan of action to address these issues and make sure that the women who are awarded these scholarships can actually use them.
It sounds like they're not letting this one slide.
No, they're not.
They're really pushing for a solution.
Mm-hmm.
But, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another critical issue that they addressed, which is the safety and the violence against women.
Right.
Now, obviously, this is a global problem.
Of course.
But what's the situation like specifically in Guyana?
Well, the statistics are pretty alarming. In 2024, the domestic abuse crime rate in Guyana was 196.85 incidents per 100,000 people.
Wow.
To kind of put that into perspective, that's almost 200 incidents for every 100,000 people, almost 2%.
Yeah.
And while the government's aim is to reduce that to 177.7 per 100,000 in 2025.
Okay.
You do have to wonder if that target is ambitious enough,
Right.
given the scale of the problem, especially when you consider Guyana's relatively small population size.
Yeah, those numbers are really sobering.
Hmm.
It's one thing to talk about violence against women in like these general terms, but when you see those hard statistics,
Yeah.
it really hits home.
It is.
And it makes you think, what's driving those high rates of violence, specifically in Guyana? Are there any unique cultural or socioeconomic factors at play here?
That's a crucial question, and to be honest, it's not one that we can answer definitively based on this press conference alone.
Okay.
The AFC does point out that there's a lack of what they call disaggregated data on domestic violence, which makes it difficult to tailor solutions
Right.
to specific communities or demographics.
So it's not just about knowing that the violence is happening.
Right.
It's about understanding the who, what, where, and why
Exactly.
to really get a clearer picture.
Mm-hmm.
But even without that really granular data, surely the AFC has some ideas about how to address this.
They do. They really stressed the importance of addressing the root causes of violence,
Okay.
which they see as these deeply ingrained cultural norms and power imbalances.
Yeah, between men and women.
Exactly. And they specifically called for anger management training and these broader public awareness campaigns to challenge those harmful gender stereotypes and promote, respectful relationships.
So it sounds like they're advocating for a combination of practical interventions
Yeah.
and broader cultural shifts.
Mm-hmm.
But is that enough? I mean, anger management training might help some individuals,
Right.
but can it really dismantle those deeply rooted societal norms that contribute to this violence against women?
That's a valid concern. And to be honest, the AFC's proposals in this area do feel a bit vague.
Yeah.
It's easy to call for cultural change.
Right.
But how do you actually achieve that?
Exactly.
What concrete steps are they envisioning taking? How will they measure the effectiveness of these initiatives?
Right.
Those are questions I think that need a little bit more exploration.
It feels like we're getting a sense of their overall philosophy.
Yeah.
But the specifics of their plan are still a bit fuzzy.
Mm-hmm.
But before we dig into that further, I do want to loop back to something you mentioned earlier,
Sure.
which is the lack of this disaggregated data. That seems like a major obstacle, not just in understanding the violence against women, but addressing a whole range of women's issues.
You're absolutely right. The AFC repeatedly emphasized the need for better data collection and analysis throughout this press conference.
Yeah.
And they're not alone in this call. A lot of advocates and experts argue that you just can't effectively address a problem if you don't fully understand its scope and its nature.
So better data is crucial.
Absolutely.
But what about those communities where reporting is already low, maybe due to cultural taboos or a lack of trust in authorities?
Yeah.
How do you collect reliable data in those contexts?
That's the challenge, isn't it? The AFC acknowledges that underreporting is a significant issue, particularly among certain economic groups. And in those more remote areas where access to female police officers, for example, is limited,
Right.
they are advocating for more sensitive and more culturally appropriate approaches to data collection.
Okay.
But again, the details of how they actually plan to achieve that are still unclear.
All right, so we've got economic empowerment.
Safety and violence.
Yeah.
And this overarching need for better data collection.
Right.
What other key themes emerged from this press conference? Did the AFC address things like education and social support systems?
They did. And this is where we really see those issues of economic empowerment, safety, and data all kind of intertwining.
Okay.
They expressed serious concern about those high dropout rates and those low matriculation levels, especially among women in what they call the hinterland region.
Okay.
And just so you know, that term refers to the sparsely populated forested interior of Guyana.
Okay.
That's often overlooked in terms of, development and resources.
Right. So they're highlighting that these issues are often amplified in those more marginalized communities.
Exactly.
But what are they actually proposing to do about it?
Well, they see education as a crucial pathway to empowerment, which is where that idea of the women's bank comes back into play.
Okay.
They believe that improving access to finance for women could have this ripple effect.
Leading to greater support for girls' education.
Okay.
If families have more financial stability, they're less likely to pull their girls out of school to work.
Right. So it's all interconnected. Economic empowerment can create the conditions for better education, which in turn leads to more opportunities for women and girls.
Exactly.
But is that enough? I mean, financial assistance is great.
Yeah.
But what about the quality of the education itself?
Right.
What about the systemic barriers that prevent girls, especially in these marginalized communities, from succeeding, even if they do stay in school?
You're raising some really important points. And to be honest, the AFC didn't delve into those specifics during this press conference.
Right.
They did mention the need to mainstream gender issues into all aspects of national planning.
Mm-hmm.
They used vocational training as an example.
Okay.
But again, it's kind of a broad statement without a lot of detail.
It sounds like they're still working on fleshing out those policy proposals.
Yeah, I think so.
But at least they're acknowledging the complexity of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And pointing to the need for this multifaceted approach.
Absolutely.
Well, we're running a little short on time here.
Okay.
Can you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways before we got to move on?
Absolutely. So the AFC's press conference really highlighted some of the most pressing issues facing women in Guyana today.
Mm-hmm.
We've got economic inequality,
right?
Violence barriers to education, and that urgent need for better data collection.
Mm-hmm.
They proposed some bold solutions like that creation of a women's bank.
Right.
But many of their ideas still need further development.
And importantly, they emphasized the need for collaboration.
Yes.
Between the government, NGOs, and community leaders to achieve that lasting change. But what about the role of individuals?
Yeah.
What can we as just ordinary people do to contribute to this effort?
It's a great question.
But we'll explore that question and delve a little deeper into the AFC's proposed solutions when we come back.
Sounds good.
Right after this break.
Anyway.
So we've laid out some of those major challenges, but, the AFC didn't just stop at identifying problems. They also put forward some potential solutions.
Mm-hmm.
What stood out to you?
Well, throughout the press conference, they kept coming back to this idea of collaboration, like an all-hands-on-deck approach to tackling these really complex issues.
Right.
And they see a really crucial role for organizations like Red Thread and Blossom, which are already doing incredible work on the ground.
I'm familiar with those organizations by name, but could you remind us what exactly they do and why the AFC is putting so much emphasis on their role?
Sure. So Red Thread is a long-standing women's rights organization in Guyana, and they provide a wide range of support services to women who have experienced violence.
Right.
And they're also really actively involved in advocating for policy changes that promote gender equality.
Okay.
Blossom, on the other hand, focuses specifically on empowering young women through mentorship programs and educational initiatives. So they're all about building leadership skills and confidence in the next generation.
It sounds like they're both filling these really crucial gaps in the support system for women and girls. But if the AFC is calling for this increased collaboration with these organizations, what does that actually look like in practice? Are they talking about specific partnerships or initiatives?
That's where things get a little vague.
Okay.
They praise the work of these organizations, stress the need for increased government funding to support their efforts, but they didn't really delve into the specifics of how that collaboration would actually play out.
It's kind of like saying we need to work together,
right?
But without actually defining what that teamwork entails.
Exactly.
But I do see their point about the need for more funding. These organizations are often operating with very limited resources.
Yeah.
And they're facing this huge demand for their services.
Exactly. And that raises a broader question about the government's commitment to addressing these issues. Are they actually putting their money where their mouth is?
Right.
Or are they just paying lip service to women's rights without allocating the necessary resources to actually make a difference?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's one thing to make promises and give speeches. It's another thing entirely to back those words up with concrete action and funding.
Absolutely.
But let's move beyond the issue of funding and talk about another key theme that emerged from this press conference, which is these legal and systemic barriers. What did the AFC have to say about that?
Well, they rightly pointed out that even if women do feel empowered to report violence or to seek help, they often encounter a system that doesn't adequately protect them or deliver justice.
These specifically mentioned the lack of female police officers in certain areas, right? I can imagine how intimidating and uncomfortable it would be for a woman, especially one who has experienced sexual violence, to have to report that abuse to a male officer.
Absolutely. And that's just one very small example of how those systemic barriers can prevent women from accessing justice.
It's not just about having laws on the books.
Right.
It's about ensuring that the entire system, from law enforcement to the courts, is actually sensitive to the unique needs and experiences of women who have been victims of violence.
And speaking of sexual violence, the AFC brought up that issue more broadly.
They did.
What were their main concerns in that area?
Well, they expressed serious concern about the lack of comprehensive data on sexual violence.
Okay.
which again makes it very difficult to understand the full scope of the problem
Right.
and to design effective interventions.
So once again, we come back to this issue of data.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a recurring theme throughout this press conference.
Absolutely.
You can't solve a problem if you don't fully understand it, and that requires reliable, detailed information.
Right.
But how do you gather that data on these really sensitive issues like sexual violence, especially in contexts where there's a lot of stigma and underreporting?
That is a huge challenge. The AFC talked about the need to really break down those taboos and create a more supportive environment.
Where survivors feel safe coming forward.
Right.
They also stress the importance of training law enforcement officials and healthcare providers to respond to those sexual violence cases with greater sensitivity and expertise.
So it sounds like they're advocating for a more holistic approach, recognizing that legal reforms alone aren't enough.
Right.
You need to address those cultural attitudes and social norms that perpetuate the violence and silence the survivors.
Absolutely.
But that kind of cultural shift takes time and sustained effort.
Yeah.
I'm curious how the AFC plans to actually measure progress in this area.
That's a great question, and unfortunately one that wasn't fully addressed in this particular press conference.
Okay.
It's easy to make promises and to call for change,
Right.
but it's a lot harder to actually demonstrate those tangible results.
Of course.
Especially when you're dealing with these complex social issues.
Yeah.
I think we'll need to see more concrete action plans and evaluation metrics to really assess the impact of their proposals.
Fair enough. It's still early days.
Mm-hmm.
And we may need to wait for more detailed policy announcements to really get a clearer sense of their strategy.
Right.
But looking back at everything we've discussed so far, it's clear that the AFC is taking this multifaceted approach to addressing women's issues in Guyana.
Yeah.
They're talking about economic empowerment, safety and violence, education data collection, legal reforms, cultural change. It's a lot to take on.
Yeah.
Do you think they're spreading themselves too thin, or are they trying to tackle too much at once?
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
It is ambitious, to say the least.
Right.
And there's always a risk that when you try to do too much, you end up doing nothing particularly well.
Right.
But I also think there's something to be said for taking that holistic view. Because, you know, these issues are all interconnected.
Right.
You can't address violence against women without tackling the underlying economic and social inequalities that contribute to it.
That's true. It's all part of the same fabric. But let's not lose sight of the fact that these are complex, deeply rooted problems. There are no quick fixes or easy answers here, even with the best intentions, and a really well-crafted plan. Achieving lasting change is going to require a sustained effort.
Yes.
And a willingness to adapt and learn along the way. But before we get into that, let's take a quick moment to hear from our sponsors. We spent a lot of time unpacking the AFC's perspective on these challenges, but I keep coming back to something they emphasize again and again, this call to action, this idea that everyone has a role to play in actually driving change. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these issues. But what does that individual action actually look like? What can we as just ordinary people do to contribute to a more equitable and empowering environment for women in Guyana?
It's such a powerful question, and I think the AFC offers some really valuable insights here. They start by stressing the importance of awareness. We can't solve problems that we don't understand. So step one is really educating ourselves about the specific issues facing women in Guyana. Go beyond the headlines.
Dig a little deeper into the research, listen to the voices of those who are directly impacted.
So knowledge is power, but what do we do with that knowledge? How do we translate that awareness into meaningful action?
Well, think of it like this: awareness is the spark.
Okay.
But action is the fuel that keeps the fire burning.
I like that.
So once you're informed, you can start making choices that really align with your values. Maybe you're inspired to support organizations like Red Thread or Blossom. Donate to their cause, volunteer your time, spread the word about their work.
Or maybe you're in a position to advocate for change within your own sphere of influence. Challenge those harmful gender norms that you see playing out in your family or your workplace or your community.
Exactly.
Speak up when you witness injustice or discrimination.
Yeah, those little things make a huge difference.
And remember, those individual actions, however small they may seem, can have this ripple effect. They can inspire others to take action.
Create a shift in public discourse and ultimately contribute to a more just and equitable society.
Couldn't agree more.
They also talked about the importance of holding the government accountable.
Yeah.
Making sure that they're following through on their commitments and actually allocating the resources to address these issues.
Right.
But how do we as individuals hold an entire government accountable?
It starts with staying informed, pay attention to government policies and budgets. Related to women's issues, are they actually prioritizing gender equality?
Right.
Are they allocating sufficient funds to those organizations that are working on the ground? Once you have that information, you can start making your voice heard.
Right.
Write to your elected officials, participate in those public forums, join advocacy groups that are pushing for change.
So it's a combination of those individual actions, community engagement, and holding those in power responsible. It's understanding that change doesn't just magically happen.
Yeah.
It requires that sustained effort from all levels of society.
Yeah. And it's about recognizing that this isn't just a women's issue.
Right.
This is a human issue.
Of course.
Creating a more just and equitable society benefits everyone.
It really does. This deep dive has been so illuminating, and I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of the complexities of these issues. But as you said earlier, this is really just the beginning of the conversation.
It is.
It's up to each of us to continue exploring, learning, and taking action.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
Guyana is currently experiencing this period of really rapid economic growth. And this presents both a challenge and an opportunity.
Yeah, I see that.
The challenge is to ensure that this growth benefits all citizens, not just a select few.
Right.
But the opportunity is to leverage this growth to create a more equitable and empowering environment for women, where they can fully participate in and contribute to the country's development.
It's a powerful vision and one that requires all of us to do our part. So let's move beyond awareness and into action.
Yes.
Let's challenge those harmful norms. Support those organizations that are working tirelessly to make a difference, and hold our leaders accountable for creating a more just and equitable CAS. Guyana, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.